Welcome, everybody. My name is Jennifer Core. I'm the Executive Director of the Tennessee Historical Society. This is Session 8 of Tennessee 101, Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era. Thank you for joining us tonight. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few housekeeping details. Well, if it'll let me go to the next slide. There we go. To register for next week and the following sessions, go to our webpage, tennesseehistory.org/home/programs, and you'll see the purple Tennessee 101 there. If you click on that, it'll take you to all of the upcoming sessions that we have. This is what a page looks like that's devoted to each session. In the bottom right, you'll see some resources. One is a link to the Tennessee Women in the Progressive Era volume that Dr. Mary Evans edited about 10 years ago now. The other one is a link to Padlet, which is a fancy term for our cloud storage. This is what the Padlet looks like. We've been working on filling it up with resources for you. So you can go here and you can look at slides. You can find recordings of the previous sessions. You can also find links to blog posts that we might find interesting or articles. And then after each session, if you should happen to miss one, that we are recording this and we do put the recording on the page at the bottom. Follow us on social media. It's the best way to get updates about our particular programs. And here are all of our handles. And I wanted to tell you that you can turn on your closed captioning if you go to your toolbar. It's down to the far right of the toolbar, and you want to turn on your live transcripts, and then you'll be able to see an automated transcript. Another thing is, don't bother raising your hand. We don't know what to do with that if you do. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and then we will have time at the end to discuss with both of our presenters tonight. Don't bother putting anything in the chat. We will use the chat to communicate with you. So if we mention a link or a book, you can look in the chat and find it. And my advice to you is if there's a link that you're interested in, go ahead and click on it so that you open it before we end the session. Finally, we'd like to thank Humanities Tennessee, who is sponsoring all of these programs. Without them and their financial support, we wouldn't be able to do this. And with that, I'm going to turn you over to Dr. Mary Evans. Dr. Evans is going to introduce our speakers for the evening. Go right ahead, Mary.
All right. Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Nikki and Tori. Once again, Manoa Uffelman and I are so very appreciative that the Tennessee Historical Society is hosting this wonderful series of lectures about progressive era Tennessee women's history. And we thank them so much, and we thank Humanities Tennessee for funding these lectures so that across the state and across the nation, for those of you who are joining us, we can explore and learn together about women's contributions to Tennessee and national history. Last week, studying how Tennessee women used acceptable roles to accomplish objectives that resulted in progress for women and for society, we learned how African-American women and rural women, who are not typically the archetypes of women progressives, at least in terms of our general knowledge of women progressives here in Tennessee, and how they shaped and bettered their societies in the late 1800s and the early 20th century. But tonight we're flipping that narrative and we're examining the very core of old Nashville, which is going to be part of two lectures we're calling appropriately Old Nashville, the very heart of white society and privilege, to study some examples of how white women impacted their community and their strata of society. So I'm very pleased tonight to introduce two of my esteemed colleagues for tonight's talks. Dr. John Simpson will speak this evening on Nashville Clubwomen in the Progressive Era, more than the UDC. Leanne Gardner and Antoinette Van Zyl just last month spoke about Black women's clubs and organizations across Tennessee. And in the antithesis of that, also in January, my colleague Manoa Uffelman spoke about Tennessee as the birthplace of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, or the UDC, reifying the lost cause ideology, which the Tennessee General Assembly apparently wishes to continue to reify in the present day. Professors Carls, LaFleur, and Astor, in part one of our series back in the fall, spoke on women's clubs in East and West Tennessee. But tonight, Dr. Simpson is going to look at Middle Tennessee white women's clubs, specifically in Nashville, and note how interwoven all the Nashville Blue Blood Society was into club activism and into progressive women's activism, circling always back, though, to the women's networks of historic allegiance to the Confederacy manifested in their membership and often in the founding mother chapter of UDC #1 in Nashville. Dr. Simpson has taught history in Kelso, Washington for 33 years and has published multiple books on Tennessee history. He's in the middle of writing a new one. His current book on the Civil War will be out here in 2022 in just a few weeks. But it's his book, Edith Pope and Her Nashville Friends, Guardians of the Lost Cause and the Confederate Veteran, which is the basis for his talk with us this evening, which again is titled Nashville Clubwomen in the Progressive Era More Than the UDC. So we very much look forward to learning from Dr. Simpson tonight. And also speaking this evening is Dr. Mary Ellen Pethel. You heard Dr. Pethel talk in this series last fall, back in middle November, when she presented then on Lady Other, Gendered Communities in College Sports, about which research she wrote in our first volume on Tennessee women's progressive activism. Dr. Pethel serves as Assistant Professor of Global Leadership Studies and Honors at Belmont University and is the director of NashvilleSites.org, a digital project focused on self-guided, mobile-friendly walking tours in Nashville. She is also widely published, and her monograph, Athens of the New South, College Life and the Making of Modern Nashville, was published by University of Tennessee Press in 2017. And she also has a book that's coming out in 2022 that focuses on the 50th anniversary of Title IX in Tennessee. But it is her book, A Heartfelt Mission, the West End Home Foundation from 1891 to 2016, which was the research contribution to our upcoming Women Progressives volume, about which she speaks with us this evening. And her talk is titled A Heartfelt Mission, Elder Care and the White Club Women in Nashville. So Mary Ellen, if you will kindly begin this evening, and at about 5:30 when you're done, if you'll just pass the webinar lectern or Zoom window directly over to John, we'll proceed seamlessly on, hopefully. And then John, when you're done at the top of the hour, if you'll pass it back to Jennifer and folks at the Tennessee Historical Society, they'll guide us into our Q&A session this evening, which we hope that all of you watching and listening will be contributing to by jotting your questions into the Q&A box as the speakers are presenting. So Mary Ellen, I turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mary. I really appreciate it. Hello, all. Just double checking. I'm assuming you'll let me know if I'm not visible and if my screen is not sharing. Welcome. Thank you for signing up. My thanks to Manoa and Mary, also to Jennifer and her team, Humanities Tennessee and the Tennessee Historical Society. This talk is about a project that I worked on in 2016 and 2017, and it culminated in a book for the West End Home Foundation. And the West End Home Foundation actually dates back to, I'm saying 1891 when it received its charter, but really even earlier than that in 1887. And although this talk is going to center on progressive era women and club women, white women specifically, I am going to pull the narrative thread through past 1922 and talk a little bit about where this organization ended up in the 50s, 60s, and then over the last 50 years. So let's go ahead and jump in. But I'll start by telling you that when I began researching for this book, which was titled A Heartfelt Mission, I was doing a lot of primary source research. The West End Home Foundation had lots and lots of primary sources at the Nashville Public Library as part of the Metro Archives. But I was having to do a lot of secondary source research. And these were topics that I was a bit unfamiliar with. And as I was doing that secondary source work, I came across some titles like this: Too Old, Too Sick, Too Bad, Nursing Homes in America. Another one was entitled, Why Survive? Being Old in America. So I knew right off the bat that I was dealing with a topic that was going to be really fun to write about. But I saw it as a mission to talk about these women and talk about elder care in a different way, in a way to flip the narrative, if you will. And so that's exactly what I did with the book and what I tried to do with this essay that will be coming out in 2022. So to get us moving along here, there we go. So this is an early photo of some women that you notice over on the right-hand side, the caption says inmates. Well, the reason that they were called inmates is because they were part of the institution. And so whether they were talking about them in terms of the meeting minutes of the club that helped to run this institution, or whether they were talking about them in news reports, they were referred to as inmates. And this organization began with the Nashville Relief Society in 1881. So way back, the Nashville Relief Society came about because of a century flood, a flood of the century. And so the Nashville Relief Society came out of that. And from that, they realized that there was a real need for care, both for orphan children, but also for elderly women. And so they created this, this home that was literally on the second floor of the Nashville Relief Society that was downtown. And then in the late 1800s, they proposed separating that organization, having a separate home for the older women. And through all of that, they called them inmates. So you'll notice here the pictures of the older women. You'll also notice some African-American women in this picture as well. So I did want to address that coming right out of the gate, that long-term care for seniors in Nashville was not limited to white women, although the Old Woman's Home organizational structure made it the most successful in terms of its longevity and its sustainability. There were other homes for the elderly population, which included an old soldiers' home, which provided shelter and care for Civil War veterans, and there was an old colored women's home known as the OCWH. Now, to be clear, the old woman's home that you see here, no Black woman was ever admitted to this home, though it's very likely none ever applied because of the era of Jim Crow and segregation and the nature of the organization itself. But there was a somewhat cooperative relationship between the old woman's home and the old colored woman's home, with the donation of particular equipment, clothing, food, and furniture. So this picture was taken in 1892. Let's now take a walk through time and see how this organization came to be and how it evolved. So as I mentioned, the Old Woman's Home was a project of the Nashville Relief Society, which was begun by the woman on your right, Fanny Battle, following the devastating flood of the Cumberland River in 1881. Then in 1887, the Nashville Relief Society published an article, or an article was published rather, as like an editorial by the Nashville Relief Society in a newspaper called the Daily American here in Nashville. And the quote reads, "It is the province of the Nashville Relief Society to take the general cognizance of the distresses of the poor. But it is our duty to listen to calls from people of every condition, the orphan, the widow, the abused and neglected wife, and the stranger who has not shelter for the night. Therefore, the securing of a large house was decided upon to more effectively take care of the aged women now under our charge." Fanny Battle was the first full-time paid staff woman of the Nashville Relief Society, a real trailblazer in the area of social work. She was a paid social worker. And so she stayed with the Nashville Relief Society, but encouraged Miss James Whitworth, or Martha Keeling, to begin a separate organization that dealt just with the elderly women who were part of this group that were living on the second floor of the Nashville Relief Society. Now, Fanny Battle would stay with the Old Woman's Home as their treasurer, and we'll come back to her in a second, because you may have heard her name because of some different organizations still active in town today. So she's going to help start the organization, and then Whitworth is going to help then the organization take off separately from the Nashville Relief Society and help them to gain a charter. So we're going to actually start with Martha Whitworth, and I'm going to talk a little bit about her. This is where you see club women, both traditional and non-traditional, coming into play. So Martha Whitworth was key in helping the Old Woman's Home to get a charter by the state, and she served as the board's first president, and she held that position from 1891 to 1900. She was instrumental in leading the effort to create an organization independent of the Nashville Relief Society, as I mentioned. She helped draft the bylaws, and she helped create the committees that helped to ultimately purchase the first separate property for residential care. She was a devout Methodist. She was a member of McKendree Methodist Church, and she was the treasurer for the Women's Board of Foreign Missions. Her husband was an executive with lots of different industries and entities in town, including Fourth National Bank. He was a lawyer. He was an executive at the NCL and St. Louis Railroad. He was a Davidson County judge. Martha Whitworth was also very active in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. Their children attended Ward Seminary, University of Nashville, and Vanderbilt University, and the Whitworths donated an initial almost $20,000 on the front end as the Old Woman's Home took flight. So this is a picture of another group of the Old Woman's Home that are now in front of their first residential property that I mentioned that Whitworth and Fanny Battle helped them to purchase. This was called the Weller House on 136 North Cherry Street. Let me tell you a little bit more about the purchase of this home. Give me 1 second to get to the right page here. Okay, so the purchase of this home was mostly the efforts of Fanny Battle and, as I mentioned, Martha Whitworth, but they are going to move to this downtown location and they are going to live there from 1887 through 1909. They're going to be able to expand the number of women that they're able to house there, and they're able to create more of a legitimate organization. So in order to, how did you get into the Old Woman's Home? How did this work? Well, you had to submit an application. You had to be recommended by multiple people. You had to pass a physical initially. You had to agree to sign over all your estate and assets. And then you had to essentially agree by the house rules, which included everything from dressing to dinner to agreeing not to argue. So you had all of these different things. So this is gonna, they're gonna live there on North Cherry Street downtown for almost 20 years. But the growing need is going to be so substantial that they begin looking outside of downtown for a larger property. Two other people who are going to be part of this effort are going to be Mrs. William Morrow, as she was seen in most of the records, but her name is Elizabeth Morrow, and then also Mrs. Joseph Reeves or Cynthia. Real quick, a note on Elizabeth Morrow. Some of her, she might have been one of the most connected club women that in the group. She and her husband provided the second lead gift to help establish the Old Woman's Home, the equivalent of about $75,000 in today's dollars. She served on the board, although she was never president, but served on the board until 1911. Her husband had been a prominent physician in the Confederate Army. He did not go back into the medical field after the war and rather opened his own business, ultimately becoming the state treasurer of Tennessee. Elizabeth Morrow was a member of the McKendree Methodist Church, Lady Hermitage Association, Centennial Club, the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And then her daughter, who was also very active in the Old Woman's Home, her name is Libby. She shows a little bit of a generational shift, if you will, in terms of club women. She's part of the Old Woman's Home. She serves in what's known as the Young Women's Auxiliary. But Libby was very different from her mother. She went to Vanderbilt, graduated from Vanderbilt, was a major in journalism, became an editor at the Nashville Banner, joined the Nashville Golf and Country Club, and perhaps most surprisingly for a Southern belle in the early 20th century, she was a divorcee and a charter member of the Nashville Equal Suffrage League. So I wanted to mention her as well. But here's our main character here, especially for the Progressive era, and Mrs. Samuel J. Keith, better known as Lizzie Keith. She was a formidable and fearless leader in the Nashville Clubwomen's movement, and she is going to mostly live in Nashville her entire life with a short stint in New Orleans. She's going to join the efforts of the Old Woman's Home in 1891, then become its president in the late 1890s. Her husband is connected. He's an executive with Fourth National Bank. With Vanderbilt, he helps to lead the 1897 Exposition. They're also members of McKendree Methodist Church. She was also part of the West End Literary Club, Ladies Hermitage Association, Centennial Club, and Belmont Country Club. But it was really her devotion to the Old Woman's Home that was central to her identity. This was her true cause and her true passion. Her grandson, Walter Keith, actually recalled, "The Old Woman's Home was my grandmother's life's work, and with great respect, she just simply called it the home. She visited at least twice a week, and he would often go with her to visit." He said of Lizzie Keith, her existence was her family, her church, and the Old Woman's Home. She is going to serve as president for over 2 decades, and she's going to transform this fledgling organization into a nonprofit powerhouse that not only served the needs of elderly women, but also helped raise the social status of women who were members of its board and its auxiliary. By the end of her term, the Old Woman's Home had become, according to a newspaper article in the 1920s, quote, "the worthiest caused and best managed organization in Nashville." So this move, if we go back to the Weller House that was downtown, it's going to be Lizzie Keith, Morrow, and Reeves who are going to help recognize the need to move out to West End, to, at that time, the suburbs, and to raise the funds needed to build this Victorian home on West End. If you're wondering where this is, if you know where on West End, it's called Vanderbilt Place, but it's where you have the French shop. It's where there's a Chipotle there. There's I want to say a Ted's Montana Grill. There's a Honey Baked Hams. There's a Subway. There's a UPS store. That shopping center. That is the exact space where this grand Victorian home sat. This building, they began raising funds for it as early as 1906. Then by 1908, after a bequest, they were able to have the groundbreaking ceremony in 1908. And this is really going to mark a huge new chapter for the Old Woman's Home. Just a trivia, Sarah Ward Conley was an architect and consultant, not the main architect, but she was a consulting architect on the project. And she was a Ward Seminary graduate and had also served as the architect of the Woman's Building at the Centennial Exposition of 1897. She was also not on the board, but she was a big supporter of the Old Woman's Home. So I wanted to mention her because she did contribute to the architectural design here. When they had the groundbreaking ceremony, Percy Madden, who was the husband of one of the women involved on the board of directors, he walked to the podium with the following quote: "What a noble institution, what a grand purpose. When father and husband and children have gone, when their locks are whitened by the snows of many winters and their faces are furrowed, perhaps with sorrow and with years, here they will find a haven of rest." This building is going to be completed in 1909. It's just on the other side of Vanderbilt University. At the time, just put this into, $1909, the cost was $23,000. Today, that would be at a cost of over $700,000. And so they moved these women. Imagine these women being moved from the Weller House downtown to this home out on West End Avenue. It was a carriage ride, but might not be the carriage ride that you would think. It was a cold and windy afternoon, February the 17th, 1909, And the old ladies bid farewell to their first home on North Cherry Street and rode in carriages, thanks to the kindness of Mr. Finley Doris. These were horse-drawn funeral carriages that took them out. So imagine what a sight it must have been. These older women, older ladies waving from the carriages of the Finley Doris funeral home as they proceeded up Broadway to their new West End address. You've already seen the outside of the home. You see the inside here. This is the main parlor. The building features modern conveniences. It was illuminated, quote unquote, by electricity, state-of-the-art steam boiler for heat, stationary washstands in each bedrooms, and even some ceiling fans. They still did not have the kinds of modern conveniences that we would assume, like private toilets, showers, or air conditioning for another 50 years. But this dining room could seat up to 100 people. And you can see the the electric lamps installed there at the top. So how did they create this sustainable model? Well, they had several ways to do it. I'm really going from the least to the most. The least was that every resident who came in did have to pay an entrance fee of $100, and then later that was raised to $200. Remember, these were women who were chosen, they were recommended. They often were what you might consider the worthy poor, or even a working class, middle class. These were respectable women, church-going women, hardworking women, but those who just didn't have a family who would take them in. Remember, there weren't nursing homes at that time. There weren't assisted living. If you didn't have a family member who could take you in and support you, then you were often left to whatever funds you might have been left in terms of an inheritance. And so many of these women found themselves with nowhere really to go, and often with family funds either not left to them or dwindling, that were not going to support them until their later years. The two biggest are going to be the fundraising by the Young Women's Auxiliary. The Young Women's Auxiliary was created in the 1890s to help support the board of directors. They raise a huge amount of money with annual fundraisers, but then skip down to the fourth bullet. The board of directors took a different tack. They really went after bequests. They went after asking wealthy people in Nashville to make to leave the old woman's home something in their will. They also appealed to the Nashville elite by asking them to endow rooms for $2,000 to $3,000, where that endowed room would then have the person's name on it. But ultimately, it was about the management of the old woman's home, in that they were able to invest the monies that they received very wisely. The YWCA and the board of directors had two separate funds, and they invested in stocks and bonds, and they survived the Great Depression primarily because they had mostly invested in really big companies, utility companies, and transportation companies. So they actually received quite a bit of income from the interest of their investments. What did their services include? So what did the elder care include if you were a resident of the old woman's home? Well, it was really a pretty sweet deal if you're thinking about finances today. It included all your health care. It included all your room and board, where you're living, the food you're eating. It included your final expenses all the way through your funeral. It was really all inclusive. Now this picture is from the 1950s. What you had to do in return for that, and this does go back a little bit here, is that I didn't list it here actually, but you had to, in return, you had to will, if you were one of the women who were the residents, you had to will your entire estate. You had to sign over your entire estate to the old woman's home. And so they did get quite a bit of funding from that, whether someone had things tied up in stocks and bonds or even real estate, that was liquidated, and they were able to add that to their investment portfolio. Here's a picture of the annual Christmas dinner in 1935. I recognize I'm on my last couple minutes, so I'm winding up here. I love to include this picture simply because it kind of reminds me a little bit of like The Shining, with the little girl standing in the middle, kind of staring at you. But if you think back to that earlier photo, this is still the same dining room, right? You can still notice the chandeliers. Probably their golden age was in the 1940s and 50s. They even had a major Nashville like society function where the Young Women's Auxiliary would put on this ball that was a Christmas party where anyone who was anyone in Nashville went to this party at the Maxwell House Hotel. This was the 1940s and 1950s until the hotel was burned in a fire in 1960. But it kind of doubled as they got to have a Christmas party for the older women from the old woman's home, and they all had dates on that night who were the husbands of the women who were the board of directors or the Young Women's Auxiliary. So there's a picture of that. Also, always have to show the picture of the group known as the Gamblers. This is 1952. But ultimately, what changed? Why was this model not sustainable? And it's really two very simple answers. Social Security, which starts in 1935, and that women began getting into old woman's home in the 1940s, and then Medicare in 1965. What these two things are going to do over a period of about 50 years is that hospitals are going to shift largely to nonprofit, while health, nursing homes and elder care is going to shift to a for-profit model. And so if you're shifting to a for-profit model, then the old woman's home, their all-inclusive model of healthcare is just simply not sustainable. They sell off the big property to the shopping center. They try to build a smaller home in 1984. They changed their name. That will last until 2009, from 1884 to 2009. And then ultimately they have to make some tough decisions. Their model's not working. Their numbers are dropping. They can't keep up. The cost of what they're having to put out in terms of healthcare is not sustainable with their budgets. It just doesn't make sense given the way the industry has changed. So they shut down residential options and they moved what they called the Final Nine to the Blakeford, which is an assisted living and nursing home facility in Green Hills in 2009. And over the next 4 years, those 9 women passed away. This is, of course, a really fun shot a little bit before they moved to the Blakefords, showing you they can still have some fun at Harley-Davidson. The last 2 residents were Eleanor Hirsch, who passed away at 102, and that was in 2012. And then Lillian Harley, who was the last resident, she passed away in 2013. As a whole, the Old Woman's Home and the West End Home for Ladies had over 500 residents that it cared for in an all-inclusive environment. And by 2013, 2014, the organization has shifted again, and they are now looking back at their history. You see me there. That's when I first get involved with the West End Home Foundation, and that's part of it. They changed their name in the early 2000s to the West End Home Foundation. They shift from being residential to non-residential to grant making, and they start celebrating their history as they're also looking forward. You see Jean Ferris on the far left, who was the board president, a former board president, and then Gray Thornburg on the far right, also a former board president. We had an exhibit at the Nashville Public Library to showcase their history, and then really have ushered in a new era. There's the book that I finished in 2017, A Heartfelt Mission, that you can find on Amazon, and I think still in Parnassus. But I highly encourage you to check out their website, the West End Home Foundation.org /news, to learn about Diane Oliver, to learn about what the work that they're doing now, awarding over $1.5 million in grants in particular years. So this is a very well-funded, very historic organization whose history and the club women who began this and the way that they first built this model have created one of the most sustainable and well-endowed institutions in Nashville. John, I'm sorry I came a little bit over, but I yield the floor to you, and thank you.
My name is John Simpson, and I'm speaking today about Nashville club women in the progressive era more than the UDC. Again, I'd like to thank
John, I'm sorry to interrupt, but whenever you move your cards or your notes,
yes,
we hear a horrible sound.
Oh, okay.
So if you can just very quietly turn your pages, because they're evidently very close to the microphone.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Thank
will
you.
do that. I'd like to thank the Tennessee Historical Society and Humanities Tennessee for sponsoring this webinar. I'd like to shout out to the Tennessee State Library and Archives, where I've done work for several decades now, particularly working with the director Chuck Sherrill, and over the years, my boots on the ground, reference librarians Janella Olker and Marilyn Bell Hughes, now retired. I'd like to thank Professor Uffelman for her excellent review of the UDC goals in her January 16th or January 18th presentation. That saves me a lot of legwork. And I'd like to thank Professors Uffelman and Evans for reaching out to me in 2018 to participate in their forthcoming second volume on Tennessee women in the Progressive Era. I'd like to read from the introduction to my article, which sets the stage for my later comments. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Nashville, Tennessee promoted itself nationally as the Athens of the South, a lofty nickname conveying cultural refinement and educational advancement. And throughout the Progressive Age, which classically is dated from 1890 to 1920, there sparked within Nashville white women an energetic activism that crossed a broad spectrum of associations, societies, and clubs, all directed at improving society in general and themselves in particular. But historian Dewey W. Grantham warns in his seminal study, Southern Progressivism, that the Southern version of this national reform phenomenon was decidedly conservative in nature. And Anne Ferrer Scott adds in Natural Allies that it can be extremely tricky in categorizing Southern club women. Taking these warnings into consideration, this essay will utilize the membership rolls of the largest and most traditional white women's organization in Nashville, Nashville #1, United Daughters of the Confederacy, as the control group to trace the depth and breadth of enlightened associationism as it unfolded in Nashville during the Progressive Era. The mother chapter, or Nashville #1, has sometimes been viewed as overbearing, uncompromising, and unreconstructed guardians of the lost cause, which the group most assuredly was. But it was also the core of much of the progressive activism of urban Middle Tennessee. It turns out women's clubs of every variety crisscrossed white Nashville society. Now that's the introduction, but as I move into the slides, I want to notify the audience that my article that I had written, my essay, is quite long, with many names of individuals and many organizations and clubs in Nashville. In other words, it's impractical for me to read it aloud. So I've improvised a little bit. Bear with me in the opening background slides, because this is information of old Nashville that sets up the end goals of understanding the transformation into new Nashville and the role of white women in the club women, that is, in the Progressive Era. So with that, let me see if I'm going to take you all back in time, some of you before you were even born. In 50 years ago, in late 1972, I was searching for a master's thesis topic, and I discovered at the University of Arkansas Library a complete run of the Confederate Veteran magazine, all 40 volumes. Well, fast forward a year later, I finished my master's thesis, and it was a focus on the content of the magazine. And as you can see on the screen here, The Confederate veteran was a clearinghouse for reminiscences and stories of ex-Confederate soldiers and occasionally women and normally prominent women. It became, over time, the official mouthpiece of the United Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And most important of all, which captivated my attention, was the lost cause ideology that permeated the pages of the magazine, the hero worship of ex-Confederate leaders, the let me see here, the monument construction, of a regional as well as a local nature, the providing what they called proper histories as opposed to blue pencil histories in US textbooks for school children, and particularly tackling topics like secession, pardon me, the issue of slavery, military defeat, and even pushing into Reconstruction in the terms that they called Black Reconstruction. Old South themes permeated this magazine in the 1890s. But I repeat that my initial research interest was always to chronicle the history of the Confederate Veteran magazine and not to write any kind of definitive history of the ex-Confederate memorial groups. Well, this master's program led to my continued interest when I began my PhD at Oregon, and I decided to tackle the continuing story as I saw it through the lens of biography by writing about the founder and editor of the Confederate Veteran, Sumner Archibald Cunningham. Now, S.A. Cunningham was born in Shelbyville. He was a member of the 41st Tennessee during the Civil War. In the post-Civil War, he carved out a career in journalism. He was owner and editor of the Shelbyville Commercial, the Chattanooga Times for a short spell, the Cartersville, Georgia Express, and then in the mid 1880s, he pushed on to, of all places, Manhattan, and formed a magazine called Our Day, which was designed to appeal to a, quote, transplanted Southern readership. The offices of a veteran were located on the public square in Nashville. And my biography of this fellow, S.A. Cunningham and the Confederate Heritage, I put it there just for reference if people in the audience wish to pursue more on this man's career. Well, notice that was 1994 when I wrapped that up. So my thoughts then moved on to where do I go from here? My focus obviously is going to remain on the Confederate Veteran magazine because it operated until 1932, 20 more years after the passing of Cunningham. Well, this led me to examine Cunningham's successor in the editor's chair, and that was his sole secretary of 20 years, Edith Drake Pope. Now, Pope was born in Burwood, a small community near Thompson Station in Williamson County. She was educated at the Tennessee Female Academy in Franklin. And as I mentioned, she's Cunningham's sole secretary. And she became editor for another 20 years until the magazine died in 1932. Now, what I discovered in the shift in editorship was that by the time Edith Pope took over, the Confederate veterans who were supplying the majority of content for the magazine were dying off. And therefore, the magazine is going to have some sort of shift in its content. And I began to notice a not so subtle shift in this content. It was not only giving more attention to the United Daughters of the Confederacy in general, but to Nashville #1 in particular, which had overtaken the duty of subsidizing the magazine in its lean years. Well, this shift, this subtle shift in content, I came up with a working subtitle called The Feminization of the Confederate Veteran Magazine. And this subtitle, which I didn't end up using, says a lot about where I was heading. I was very interested in who these members were in Nashville #1 and their efforts to preserve the magazine. And the basis of all of this that I've just presented on this slide is in the book I wrote on Edith Pope in 2013. I must also apologize for the fact that in all of my years of research on Edith Pope, I never found a single photograph of her. Well, moving to my new focus, if you will, I wanted to know who these women in Nashville #1 were. I sought to put faces to them. I wanted to explore and flesh out their broader affiliations and interests. I was working from the hypothesis that there was much more to the lives of these ladies than simply membership in the UDC. And you'll notice from this slide here, and I apologize for not blowing it up bigger. I'm still learning the nuances of my new laptop. But this is the 1921 convention of the Tennessee division of the UDC. And if you look carefully over the tops of the heads of the ladies, you can see numbers. These numbers reflect on the back of the photograph the names of some of these people. But I was interested in the terms of Nashville #1, wanting to delve into all of them. So I needed to create a database. So with Nashville #1, the database that I created was based on the items you see on the slide here. I delved into their marital status, their family connections. I traced the generational growth of Nashville #1, which, by the way, spiked 3 times in the progressive era. I looked into residential patterns, and I've got some funny stories about that I can hold off till the end. I also looked at employment, if it was applicable, and also educational background. The sources that I used for this, you would probably understand are pretty understandable. Nashville newspapers from the entire progressive era, Nashville city directories, the census data from Davidson County, the massive UDC collection at the Tennessee State Library. But there are also some very helpful books. I wouldn't call them secondary sources because they were written in the first decade of the 20th century, but they're very helpful in listing the names of the daughters of Nashville #1 in other clubs. For instance, Dow's Blue Book of Nashville names, Geraldton's Social Directory of Nashville, Clark's All About Nashville, Waller's 2 books on Nashville from 1890 to 1910. All of this helped me to reach the following conclusion, that there was expansive participation of the Daughters of Nashville #1 in other organizations of the time period. So with that, I needed to get a handle on the associational overlap. And one of the previous speakers in this series used that word overlap, and I loved it. Because what I had to do was try to quantify the women who were in these various clubs. And rather than read the clubs to you, I want to I want to present to you some of the many clubs that Nashville #1 members joined. So going down the list, the patriotic, historical, and hereditary clubs, associations, or societies, you'd always have to start off with the Ladies Hermitage Association. It preceded the UDC, and many members just flowed from one group to the other. There were also the clubs that are familiar to us today, the chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and the Colonial Dames. Less known clubs would include the Association for the Preservation of Virginia Antiquities, but also its Tennessee Antiquities counterpart. The Daughters of 1812, the Watauga Association, the American Historical Association, the Tennessee Women's History Association, the Andrew Jackson Society, and yes, the Tennessee Historical Society. When we look at literary clubs, quite often the name of the club itself told of the interest of the membership. Not so with the first one I'm going to read, which was the Friday Morning Literary Club, which what I gleaned from that is they met on Fridays. But then you have other clubs like the Authors Club, the 20th Century Literary Club, the Magazine Circle, Nashville Storytellers Club, Shakespeare Club, the Review Club, and the International League of Press Clubs. In the realm of self-improvement and municipal housekeeping, I tossed a couple of clubs in here that don't belong there, but I didn't have a category for them. They included the Nashville Art Association and the Gardening Club of Nashville. But the other self-improvement clubs, you can tell from their titles: the Wednesday Study Group, the YWCA programs, and the programs of Watkins Institute in downtown Nashville, where in both instances, there were several daughters who lent their expertise to domestic science and the proper health and hygiene of maintaining a household. Other clubs related to that would be the Housekeepers Club and the National Housewives Association. Two clubs that I found particularly interesting in this self-improvement category were the Query Club, Q-U-E-R-Y, and the Metaphysical Club, both intellectual clubs and with programming that was most impressive. In terms of civic boosterism, we have to start there with the Centennial Club of 1905. In fact, it's my interpretation that the most significant women's club of the 1890s and early 1900s was the Nashville UDC chapters. But by 1905, we're starting to see a significant change, and that's with the Centennial Club, which was based a lot on the fact of the rising industrialization and urbanization of Nashville, the economic revival of the city and the region. I also found some of the daughters from Nashville #1 in another locale similar to the Centennial Club, and that was the Southern Commercial Congress. When we look at neighborhoods in Nashville, there were civic clubs there as well, like the South Nashville Federation of Women and the East Side Civic Club. When we look at the humanitarian and benevolent and religious affiliations, you would have to start with the Red Cross. And obviously during the World War I era, Women in Nashville #1 were frequenters of the surgical bandage preparations that would go on once a week and held at the Tulane Hotel downtown. But there were other humanitarian and benevolent societies as well, like the King's Daughters, the Protestant Orphan Asylum, the Polk and Scott Street Day Home for Children. We would call that a daycare today. The St. Luke's Settlement House and the Vanderbilt AIDS Society. In terms of religious, basically any church of significant size in the downtown core, and as well as in East Nashville and out the West End, had members that also hailed in Nashville #1. In terms of physical culture, this was the age, of course, of golfing and the previous Mary Ellen's comments about Libby Luttrell Morrow is very fitting. She's a very interesting lady. Joining the golf and country clubs. Nashville was sprouting 2 of them at the time at Belmont and Nashville. But there were tennis clubs and even professional baseball. In 1908, the Nashville Vols were very successful. They instituted a ladies' day, and women took them up on that. Now, I can't quantify the overlap with Nashville #1, but in terms of a quick story, the women who would attend baseball games in Nashville would wear the stylish headgear of the day, which was the Merry Widowmaker. Now, if those of you who know fashion of the time, that's a very high profile hat. And some of the men who had to sit behind these ladies wearing their Merry Widowmakers would voice their displeasure in letters to the editor because they could not see the field of play. That's our humor for this session. Moving to politics and the public sphere, there were a few members who belonged to the Women's Democratic Party, more so, quite naturally, you understand this, the Anti-Saloon League, the Southern Rejection League in terms of suffrage, but there were some women in Nashville #1 that were suffragists. And belonged to the Women's Suffrage Association, the Equal Suffrage League. I pirated this photograph on the screen of Elizabeth Lee Bloomstein. Ms. Bloomstein was trained, if you will, at Ward Seminary. She was in the first graduating class of Peabody. And for 35 years, she served as a professor of history at Peabody, and then later as librarian. And literally 16 of the clubs that I had read off were clubs that Ms. Bloomstein was a member. And she had a rather, I thought, significant statement about the role of women's clubs and the movement during her lifetime. She said, quote, "I believe that the women's club movement is the consciousness of a desire for larger relations of life," close quote. She's quite a remarkable lady, as was Libby Morrow. Mary Lou Gordon White. There's just a whole slew of women's activism that went from Nashville #1 into all of these other organizations. In terms of a conclusion, let me just quickly read that white Nashville club women of the progressive era came from a variety of backgrounds and possessed diverse interests. While the members of Nashville #1 were conservative conformists when it came to memorializing and vindicating the lost cause, they also joined and participated in other clubs, societies, and associations. The heterogeneous nature of their individual backgrounds, lifestyles, and outlooks underscores the fact that they were not one-dimensional in composition. Rather, their interests and commitments subsumed a locus of meaning. Therefore, one cannot discount the actions of conservative white women's associations in progressive issues of the day. Their substantial contribution to the public sphere made clear women's powerful capabilities as citizens to the wider society. In the end, the daughters of Nashville #1 contributed in their own unique ways to the proliferation of progressive era women's clubs and the betterment of life in the Athens of the South. Thank you. And that's my contribution, which is not Tennessee, but that is my forthcoming book 2 months from today.